Devon, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming and supporting me. I'm really excited. I've been working on this for about a year. So I'm Devon, and my thesis is equity and exploration, funding gaps between marine and space exploration, and a plan for coral reef investment. So just a little introduction about me and why I'm doing my thesis. So I'm majoring in astrophysics and I have a business minor. This summer I spent 10 days abroad in Trinidad and Tobago, and I went to ERIC, the Environmental Research Institute of Charlottesville in Tobago, and I restored the coral reefs. And while I was there, I noticed a really big difference in the funding and the resources that I was provided as an astrophysics major at ASU and the resources we had in ERIC in Tobago. So my motivation for this thesis is to explore the underlying factors contributing to disparities in funding between marine conservation and space exploration, and I'm seeking to develop a strategic investment plan to attract more funding for marine ecosystems, especially in small island nations. So while I was in Tobago, the first thing that really stood out to me and what I wanted to research was exploration in both fields. And so this graph looks a little weird. It looks like we've explored more of the marine and our oceans than we have of space, but it's a little more nuanced than that. So for space exploration, we've explored about 4% of our space, but our universe is expanding, and it's expanding by this factor. We don't know what it is, but we've attributed it to dark energy and dark matter. So dark energy accounts for about 70% of the universe, dark matter 27%, and we don't know what they are. They're invisible to us, we're still trying to figure it out. But this 4.1% is visible matter, and it's what we have explored. Then we go to marine exploration. We've explored about 20% of our oceans, and 80% remains unexplored, which is interesting because our oceans are on our Earth, but we haven't been able to research them. And the limits to exploration in both fields are quite similar. So there's pressure, temperature, visibility, and communication barriers, and we have this in both fields, but the research and technology has been quite different in both fields. So just a little background, this is a space exploration timeline. So in 1957, Sputnik was launched by the Soviet Union. It was the world's first artificial satellite. In the middle of this, we were in a long war with the Soviet Union. So in 1958, that's when NASA was founded. Since the Soviet Union was making headway in the space research realm, we wanted to as well, as we were in war with them. So we started NASA, and just a quick note that I'll go back to is that at this point, in this first decade or so at NASA, the GDP in the US was at 0.7, which is quite significant. So then, about a decade later, we had the moon landing. This was after NASA was founded, and it was a really big accomplishment for the US and really pushed us farther ahead in the war. In 1986, NASA really struggles to find their next big project. The Challenger mission was launched in 1986 and failed, and then later in 2003, the Columbia mission failed. So after this, a lot of the NASA operations were limited by policymakers, and this in turn turned us over to the private sector for space exploration. Notably, in 2002, SpaceX was founded. That's the main private sector that's doing research for space exploration. And when it was first created, it wanted to go to Mars. And now that goal has kind of mutated for us to create a livable planet for our society in the next century. And then going back to this GDP, in the early 2000s, the NASA GDP falls to 0.1, and this is largely due to the research being turned over to the private sector. So just to start off with a quote for space exploration motivations in the private sector, James Webb is a really famous astrophysicist. If you've seen NASA or the images it's putting out right now, a lot of them are from the James Webb Telescope, and a lot of innovation has been made there. And when he was a scientist, he said that space policy should never be turned over to the private sector. But obviously, it has been turned over to the private sector. So some motivations. First off, the next trillionaire is said to be the first person to mine planets and asteroids. Second, these two companies, Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic, have tapped into the $20 billion market that is space tourism. Third, satellite technology can advance global communication, climate monitoring, and navigation. And fourth, by exploring and accelerating our technology in space, a completely fresh ecosystem with unlimited benefits is open. One could say a universe of possibilities. So on the other hand, we have the status of marine research. This is mainly led by government bodies like the NOAA and UNESCO, but these initiatives have faced severe budget cuts, and they have a very small amount of private investment, unlike space. So the result of this is a much slower pace in innovation compared to the space sector. Space exploration promises new markets, but marine research is often viewed as addressing environmental issues with a much lower return rate on investments. This neglect has severe consequences for our world. A loss of biodiversity, extinction of fisheries, and vulnerability of coastal regions to extreme weather. Marine research in small island developing states. Tobago, where I went this summer, is one of them. It's kind of what I'm focusing my thesis on. Small island developing states, or SIDS, are disproportionately impacted by climate change, but they get a lot less financial and technological support for marine projects. Rising sea levels and ocean acidification threaten their economies, which are largely supported by tourism and fishing, and therefore supported by the coral reefs in their oceans that they're surrounded by. And high-tech research equipment and advanced facilities are often limited to wealthier nations like the US, Europe, and Canada. So this forces SIDS to be dependent on partnerships with these nations. And lastly, healthy marine ecosystems yield trillions of dollars annually through fisheries, coastal protections, and tourism, and they're degrading. So just an overview of my thesis. Key points: investment in science really drives innovation and technology and addresses our global challenges. Space research receives billions, while marine conservation and exploration really struggles to attain that funding. Coral reef importance: it protects our coastlines, it supports biodiversity, and it sustains our economies. And my research focus is to investigate why space research is prioritized over marine conservation and research, and to develop investment strategies for coral reef restoration and SIDS. So here's a graph of global funding for marine and space research in 2023. On one hand, we have space research, which received about $630 billion. On the other hand, we have marine research, a very startling image, you can't even see, but they received $2 billion. And that number is approximate because while space research has large sums of money by private sector and governments, it's a lot more easy to track where the funding's coming from, whereas marine research is really funded by smaller organizations and smaller sums of money, so it's kind of harder to track where it's coming from. So that brings me to my research question. What are the underlying factors contributing to the disparity in research funding between marine conservation efforts, like coral reef restoration, and space exploration? And how can a strategic investment plan be developed to attract more funding for marine ecosystems in small island nations? So I'll focus more on the first part first, but here are my research methods. First, I found interviewees. I decided to do interviews for my thesis because I'm not an expert in marine conservation or research, and I'm also not an expert in the finance side of it, so I wanted to find experts in both fields with some different perspectives, and I'll go more into who those people are in a second. Next, I prepared my interview questions. This was largely based off of my preliminary research and my research question. Next, I conducted the interviews and I transcribed them. And then I created categories based on the information found from my interviews and from my research question. Once again, this was created from my preliminary research, the important things I noticed during my interviews and my research question, and then I placed the quotes from the interviews into the categories. So here are my interviewees. First is Alyosha Wolke. He's the executive director and co-founder at the Environmental Research Institute in Charlottesville, which is ERIC, where I studied this summer. He was a really interesting perspective because not only has he done a lot of marine research and restoration in his career, but he also is a director and co-founder, so he deals with all the grants and the money coming into the institute. Next is Jana Hines. She's currently getting her master's in science in biology at ASU, and she completed her undergraduate degree in conservation in biology and ecology, also at ASU. I thought she was a really interesting perspective because this summer for 5 months, she did field research in Bermuda at BIOS. So I really wanted to explore with her the differences she found when she was in Bermuda doing field research versus when she was at ASU doing research. And lastly is Jeffrey Lamb. He's a senior executive of climate finance and impact investing at Pegasus Capital Advisors. I found him because I'm subscribed to a finance email, and at the headline it was investing in coral reefs, and his private equity firm is leading that. So I wanted to see what his opinion on with investors and investing in the ecology and in coral reefs. So here's a little overview of my data analysis. There are several factors influencing funding. First is economic incentives. As an investor, your mind is mainly focused on money, and there's a very high return investment for space exploration versus there's a very uncertain promise of financial returns for marine conservation. Next is geopolitical interest. Just like when we were in the war with the Soviet Union, and it really drove our technology and innovation for space research. Space research is heavily tied to national security and prestige, while marine conservation really doesn't have that similar global urgency. And lastly, public perception. Space is seen as a future, a universe of unlimited promises and possibilities, while the oceans are overlooked despite their role in global ecosystems and the fact that they're right here and they're unknown and they're beautiful. So going into my results, first is funding problems, and I'll go into oil and gas greenwashing. This is a quote from Alyosha. A heavy amount of their funding comes from the oil and gas industry in Trinidad and Tobago, which is a really interesting point. First, too high of a GDP limits access to international aid and grants. In Trinidad and Tobago, they have a very large or very high GDP compared to other nations, but this is all really due to oil and gas. So this poses a question, is CSR, which is corporate social responsibility funding, looking to make a genuine sustainable impact, or is it just reputation damage control, right? So is the damage that the oil and gas industry doing in Trinidad and Tobago, is their funding that they're putting into ERIC really reversing the effects of what they're doing with oil and gas? Next is private versus public sector funding disparities. So on the first side, we have space research. As I mentioned before, they have very high profile projects and large scale government contracts. They also receive a lot of financial support from governments, private investors, and international organizations. So they have a very large sums of money coming from a bunch of different places. Whereas if we look at marine conservation, they really have to rely on these unstable NGO budgets, which is non-governmental organizations. They also rely on tourism and very limited government grants. And as I was talking with Alyosha, he mentioned that with these NGO budgets, they're heavily based on projects. So he'll submit a project proposal, and then he gets that money for the project, but the money isn't consistently coming in. So if they're not working on a main project, they don't have money coming in. But they have researchers, they have restorers there that they need to employ, and they have maintenance, and they can't really keep that up if they're not getting that consistent amount of funding. There's also really not a drive for private citizens to donate for conservation in Trinidad and Tobago. So that poses a large struggle for them. Next is comparative public perception and media attention. This is a quote, or an indirect quote taken from my interview with Jeffrey Lamb. He says that investors hear coral reefs and think about the return. How can there be a large financial benefit? It seems like investors are still in learning mode when it comes to marine conservation investment. It seems like more of like an ecological impact, something to reverse the effects of climate change, rather than getting in money and a return on investment, which isn't necessarily true. The name of the funds that he mainly works with is the Green Climate Fund, and he mentions how the name of the fund is really limiting, because when you hear green climate, once again, you only think about how this is helping the environment. It doesn't seem like there's a high return rate. And this all goes into investor prejudice. Next is technology and resource allocation. So Jana Hines says we're using plastic toothbrushes to clean the corals because we didn't have better tools. I also experienced this when I was in Tobago. She also reflects on having to go on a manhunt to find materials to rig an aquarium herself. She mentions how she was sitting on the wet concrete floor in the lab, sawing things and using a plunger to unclog things. But she's done years of education for marine research. She never learned how to do these things herself. So it's a really big change for her. So in return, researchers really need to become resourceful and find makeshift solutions to have any headway in technology or innovation. This creates a limit to the scalability and the efficiency of marine research, and long-term restoration projects become really difficult to sustain, because while you're trying to do research, you find yourself having to jerry-rig all your materials, whereas that doesn't really happen in space research. So lastly is the economic benefits. As I said before, it doesn't seem like coral reef restoration or protecting our oceans has a lot of economic benefits, but it truly does. First is fisheries. The fish live in coral reefs and they protect our fish. So without the coral reefs, our fish are dying, they aren't protected, and in return, fisheries struggle. Next is coastal protection. The coral reefs are really that first line of defense for when harsh weather hits coasts. And so without that first line of defense, the impacts of harsh weather are much worse. And then lastly, tourism. Tourism is a really important economic opportunity for these nations. A lot of people want to go and do vacations, scuba dive, snorkel, see the coral reefs, see the beautiful oceans that we don't get to see necessarily here in the US. But without those coral reefs, without that ocean, that beautiful ocean, tourism really declines. So on to the second part of my research question. How can a strategic investment plan be developed to attract more funding for marine ecosystems in small island nations? So first, we have some challenges, but with those challenges, we also have opportunities. So to start, marine conservation lacks the financial backing that space research has, but that presents an opportunity. Education investment can transform both research funding and local economies. Alyosha was telling me about how he's really limited on grants because he's not an education institute, and so you get a lot more funding if you're in the education route. Next is many small island nations like Tobago rely on fishing, but they lack the education on sustainable practices. So high-level institutions can attract more funding, while local schools can incorporate marine conservation into the curricula, and therefore sustainable fishing practices can be done. So here are some investment plans. So we have our coral reefs and the three things that they really benefit to the economy. And then trickling down from there, we have some ideas for investment plans. So first is the Reef Integrated Coastal Protection Fund. So this is a public-private partnership, and it funds artificial reef structures in order to protect the coast. And so this revenue can come in from government contracts and insurance incentives, since the harsh weather won't be as bad with the coral reefs. That poses a big incentive for insurance companies. Next, we go into tourism. There's reef-backed ecotourism, which is what Jeffrey Lam is doing. He's making hotels in small island nations in order to attract funding. So these are like eco-lodges, reef-integrated resorts, and the funds profit restoration. And so revenues can come from hotel bookings, guided dives and snorkeling trips, marine conservation fees, and private donations. And next, for tourism, we also have blue bonds. So these are government or development banks issuing blue bonds. So blue bonds, they work the same way as a regular bond. They just benefit the oceans. There's also green bonds, which benefit the earth. And so these bonds can finance conservation efforts and projects, and investors get returns from the combination of tourism, carbon credits, and government-backed repayments. There's actually an example of this. Seychelles is doing this now, and they issued a $15 million bond. And lastly, we have fishing. There's the Reef Farm and Sustainable Fisheries Fund. So this is investing in coral nurseries. Similar at Eric, we were doing coral nurseries, and reef farming businesses. So this is just sustaining the reefs. When we were in Eric, we were making new reefs and growing them. And so right now there's a really big market demand for ethically sourced seafood, which we'll go into that. And then they also fund coral transplantation growing. An example of this is the Coral Rita project in the Bahamas. And then lastly, we have PE-backed MPAs, that's private equity-backed marine protection areas. So this is when private equity firms partner with marine conservation trusts, and they fund the enforcement of protecting our marine areas, and they also fund reef restoration. So the returns on this are sustainable fisheries, tourism fees, and carbon markets. And studies show that MPAs can increase fish biomass by 400%. So lastly, we'll go into education investment. When I was at Eric in Tobago, we went to a local school and we kind of talked on what we were doing, the importance of coral reefs in our oceans, and how they can practice sustainable fishing. Tobago and where we were in Charlottesville is a really big fishing area. Fishing's kind of passed down through families, and the fisheries are kind of declining because fish are dying and there aren't as many fish now because of overfishing. So, for education investment, there are a couple of ideas. First is marine research and sustainability universities. These are focused on ocean loans, coral restoration, sustainable fishing. They offer degrees and training programs and community outreach, just like we did at Eric. The revenue can come from tuition research grants, corporate partnerships, government NGO funds, and ecotourism programs. Next is public and private marine innovation hub. These are also private equity backed. They're a partnership with universities, local governments, and international institutions. They fund marine technology and research and sustainable blue economy startups. And next we have the Sustainable Ocean Leadership Academy. This is a vocational school for local communities for certifications in sustainable fishing, reef restoration technology, ecotourism, and marine hospitality. The revenue can come from partnerships with dive shops, fisheries, certification fees, NGO and international agencies funding, and then community education programs. And so these all have a very large impact on the community that they would support. First, they would get more funding, as Alyosha said. Research institutes and education receives a lot more funding. They have a lot more access to it, so you get more funding. Second is the empowerment of the community. Education is a large part of our economy, and by empowering them to not overfish and use sustainable fishing practices, fisheries can be sustained. And lastly, there's long-term economic benefits with fisheries, with protecting our coasts, and with tourism, just like with teaching people the marine hospitality part can really help hotels. So in conclusion, there are some key takeaways. First, education is the foundation for sustainable marine conservation. Second, investing in schools and research institutes will drive innovation and will lead to a lot more long-term consistent funding. Next, public-private partnerships can support marine conservation while also providing economic incentives. And then lastly, small island nations can directly benefit from integrating sustainability into their local economies. Some study limitations. As I was doing this study, my biggest challenge was probably the lack of existing research. There really isn't much research comparing space research and marine research and the funding that they get. But it was really interesting to do those two separate things by myself and try and connect them. And after analyzing my results, there were some additional questions and topics that I wish I had dived deeper into when I was doing my interviews. But this also leads to the future of research and what we can improve upon in this study. We can do a deeper analysis of investor behavior and ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance funding. Next is economic modeling of blue economy investments. So doing some more modeling of the investments strategies that I have proposed. They're just ideas, but doing some modeling could be really beneficial and promising to investors. Next is technological advancements in marine research and conservation. These technology advancements are really lacking as of right now, just like Jana Hines was saying, where she's jerry-rigging things. And then lastly, to further investigate the impact of marine conservation curriculum in small island developing states. So I'm just gonna leave you with a closing statement. While billions are spent on leaving Earth, our oceans are neglected. Yet marine conservation isn't just an environmental need, it's a massive economic opportunity. Sustainable fisheries, reef-backed ecotourism, and the blue economy can drive prosperity if we shift investor behavior. Instead of abandoning Earth, we should invest in helping it thrive. Because the real question isn't if we can afford to protect our oceans, it's if we can afford not to. Thank you.